Well, welcome to the next episode in our Gospel Conversations series. We're beginning with the talks with Ben. We've opened up the whole arena of growth and what growth constitutes, particularly from the vision of the early church. Ben, in his talk on growth, reminded us how the early church fathers did not have the penal substitution model of atonement. They had a different view of atonement, and their view was more positively framed as participation in the Godhead. That's what humanity is called towards. Now, if you have that view, clearly you're going to have as a consequence a somewhat different view of, well, what's sanctification mean? And Ben opened up the wonderful pathway of thought that for them this was actually being caught up and to participate in Christ, to become little Christs in the world. So that's, if nothing else, that's a vision of growth that is framed positively from a visionary point of view. You could almost call it an eschatological vision of growth. Then subsequent to that, we've had the, wonderful interview with David Bentley Hart on the word sin, because obviously the flip side of growth is sin. What do we do with morality? What do we do with behaviour and so on? And David opened up a tremendous landscape for us, really a paradigm shift away from a guilt-based view of sin to a view that was more emanating from the literal Greek meaning of missing the mark. So sin is defined as a missing of the mark, and that in turn means that now if I'm missing the mark, what is implied, which David developed extensively, was intrinsic to every human being is a valuing of the mark. There is an impulse toward the good in humankind that's inbuilt, and that impulse toward the good certainly can be deceived. So the issue becomes not so much some inner cancer that's leading me into bad outcomes that needs to be eradicated, more a innate desire to the good that needs to be undeceived, that needs to be illuminated in order that it can direct its attention toward the good and not miss the mark in life. I want to supplement that now by almost going underneath that. If David's view was top down, sin is missing the mark, i.e. it's missing the mark of glory, let's go inside the soul and inside our psychological internal experience and say, well, what happens there? And to do that, I'm going to look at Macrina and the Socratic dialogue, really, between her and her brother, Gregory of Nyssa, that framed the wonderful treatise called On the Soul and the Resurrection. Now, this is very dense. The book is short, but dense. Gregory was a compact thinker and wonderfully succinct, but when you read him, it's a challenge to unpack the sentences, not because they're opaque or poorly written, because they're so profound. So I expect most of us won't actually read, which is a pity because there is so much locked up. So the whole idea of this talk is fairly summative. I'm summarising what she says in part of this treatise, not the whole lot, but the part that is directed toward what we could call the topic of sin. Now, this is really interesting because we are definitely confronting a feminine mind here. There, of course, is some discussion as to whether the dramatic situation that is set up in this dialogue is a fiction or whether it's accurate. Now, the dramatic dialogue is Macrina is the teacher, and her younger brother, he was younger, Gregory, was the pupil. The circumstances in which the dialogue takes place are really poignant. They are after the funeral and death of their brother, Basil the Great, who was just a dominant figure in their lives and the lives of the early church. Gregory's grief-stricken by the loss of his brother, and he goes to her for comfort, only to find to his dismay when he sees her that she too is dying from what looks like a cancer. So it isn't just the words of a woman, but a woman who is dying. There's no doubt that Macrina, that Macrina had educated and guided her famous brothers towards their vocation in life. There's no doubt that Macrina herself was the product of, she's a third generation Christian. It was the grandmother, I think, who was the pioneer of faith in Christ in the family, and then her mother. So it was a not just a very wealthy family, but which they were, but a family where the role of women was very significant. The leadership role of women was very significant. I think it's interesting as we listen to remember who's speaking. Right. Now, if we go now to our topic of sin, I've often reflected, even since I was fairly young, that my evangelical tradition seemed to be hampered by a kind of chessboard view of sin, a sort of snakes and ladder view of sin. In other words, sins, plural, are defined by a moral code and evidenced by bad behaviours. The trouble I found in my evangelical church, and I think it's the same today, and it's a real challenge, is that this, exactly what are the moral codes, is unspecified. So they can become stereotypes. They become cultural behavioural stereotypes. And I have been in fundamentalist church where sin would go to the clothes you're wearing, and so on. That's dangerous. That's really dangerous, that view of sin. The corollary of that inside of our souls was the concept of original sin, which I think is basically a metaphor of disease. In other words, genetic infection, beginning with Adam, that's got passed through to us. So we're all born totally sinful. We're born sinful, and how far you push that, of course, is that's sort of optional. But certainly in the extreme Calvinist tradition, it becomes total depravity and it gets pushed a long way. You know, there's no good thing in me and so on. Whatever the case, that view is introspective, and it's a view that I think is very, very damaging. It was certainly damaging to me. I mean, I didn't suffer significant mental health issues, but I know people who have, and I don't think it's in the least bit helpful in living a righteous life. What we're going to see in Macrina is very much something that David intimated in his talk, but was the dominant view, I think, of sin amongst the early church fathers. So, there's two major parts to this handling, and they're really significant. She begins her explanation, she, by the way, doesn't use the word sin, but she begins her explanation of the human condition with a very high view of humanity. So don't begin with moral codes, don't begin with behaviour, begin with the high view of humanity, going back to what David said about sin being missing the mark. Well, obviously, if I miss the mark, I've got to start my definition with the mark. What's the mark? And her mark is developed out of the fact that humanity is made in the image of God. And she develops this picture of what it is to be a human being marvellously, to the extent that her brother, who's always playing the dumb guy who's stumbling around and can't quite keep up with her, says eventually to her something like, our discussion, I'm going to quote quite a lot so that you get a sense of the prose. Our discussion leads us to conclude that our mind is the same as the divine nature. I'm so close to God, it seems that in my mind, it's my mind, or we could use the word soul. I don't know we've quite got the right word there, but either of those two words will do, almost mind soul. The mind soul part of me is the same as the divine nature. What you do in a Socratic dialogue, of course, is you use conversation to clarify points. And, he's actually interpreted what she said a little bit too literally. And she corrects him. She says, no. She says, quote, don't say the same. One is like the other. And that which is made in the image must keep a similarity to its archetype in every respect. So there has to be similarity in every respect, but it's similarity, not the same. We have an image and an archetype or a prototype upon which that image is shaped, where the image, Christ, is the archetype. And the difference, she will say, is a difference in degree. This is very important. In other words, if I have a difference in quality, then I have two things that differ in their nature. They can't ever be compared to one another. It's like an oil and water thing. If I have a difference in degree, then I have the same qualities, but the difference is the amount to which those qualities are expressed and experienced and possessed. So she says that's the difference in degree. That's the word she uses. And she uses a metaphor. By the way, the early church fathers used metaphors very well and very artfully. She says, often in a small fragment of glass, when it appears to lie in the sunlight, the whole circle of the sun is seen, not appearing in it according to its own size, but just as the smallness of the fragment allows the reflection of the sun's circle. So she's got the idea, I'm walking along and I see a bit of glass or something that will mirror the sun, and it reflects the circle of the sun. It's actually the whole sun. It's not a part of the sun, it's the whole sun. But there's a huge difference in degree, space-time measured degree, between the size of that reflection in the glass and what it is reflecting. And she says, in the same way, the smallness of our nature reflects the images of the ineffable properties of divinity. I think this is extremely important. The ratio between us and the divine is greater than the ratio between that image on the ground of the sun and the sun. It's far greater. But nonetheless, the same principles apply. Our nature is small, incredibly small. That doesn't mean we are not experiencing qualitatively similar aspects of the divine. That's what she's saying. We do not consider the small and perishable nature equal to the invisible and the immortal. So that glass is small, it's perishable, it can be differentiated from the sun in many ways, but it is still an accurate reflection. So that's how she develops the idea. Now then she goes on to something very important, which modernism failed to do in its view of rationality and cognition. In other words, it became the mind became an entirely mental thing. And she and the early church fathers simply did not have that picture. She says the mind has to use the senses, not as a tool, but there's a integration between the senses and the mind. And what the mind does, what all of our minds do when we think, is we take sensory inputs and we amplify them. And the way our mind amplifies the sensory inputs isn't even just an amplification, it's an extension. So something comes from our mind and something comes from the sensory inputs. Now she gives a great example, very poignant given what I just said about her condition, which is her doctor. She says, my doctor who's treating me, he has eyes, and his eyes, he looks at my withered arm and he can see my waning and emaciated body. But the strict parameters of those visual inputs is not what goes on in his mind. He's interpreting them as signs of the disease. So the senses on their own, if all he had was if the mind was no more than a sensory receptor, a receptor of sensory inputs, well, it couldn't think. And of course, this is where John Locke went so terribly wrong in his picture of the mind, where sensory inputs impinged upon the blank canvas of our mind. And so the mind is nothing but the sum parts of sensate inputs. It's ridiculous, and if only he'd read Macrina, he would have been spared such idiocy. She goes on and gives other examples, which are quite profound. We've never seen that. She doesn't say this one, but we've never seen the back of our head, but we imagine it. So our mind has these phenomenal imaginative faculties, which she sees as very much being the divine image in us that amplifies everything. She has a wonderful section on art, one of the best definitions of art I've ever read, which is art is a kind of steadfast thought operating through matter towards some purposes, and thought is a kind of motion and operation proper to the mind. If we were deviating off onto art and design now, that would be a great launching pad, but leave that. Where she does finish, though, is something that I must say I've thought of a lot, but she expresses it so succinctly, which is that our mind, there's a kind of an eternity in our mind. Our mind is eternalizing everything. It has actually no boundaries. And so my body is bounded. It's bounded in space and in time, but my mind is not. I mean, that's why we make movies like Star Wars. That's why we can imagine flying to the edge of the universe. That's why we can imagine going forward 100 years and back 100 years. And there's just literally, there is no finite limit to our minds. And she says, it is possible for the mind at the same time to contemplate heaven and to stretch to the limits of the universe in its curiosity. So, before she gets on to sin, she starts by scoping out the power, a very high view of humanity against which she will measure sin, but not just a high view, but an amplified view of how our mind works. Because she's going to say that it's in the workings of the mind that our challenges lie. Now, what she will do is use the word passions. So now we're going to get a differentiation. I never had any differentiation when I was a young Christian. Like a sinful thought is a sinful thought, and therefore you've got to get rid of it, you've got to suppress it. Of course, a fruitless task. She's more nuanced. She's going to pull apart passions. Passions is a very different concept to sin. And she's going to contrast passions with the soul or the mind. So they're not the same. They work together, but they're not the same. And the passions are going to be closer to the body and the sensory inputs. By the way, one of the criticisms of the early church fathers by biblical scholars is that they're dallying with Greco-Roman philosophy, not the scriptures. I think that's a really narrow view of them. But it's interesting that when she launches into this, she explicitly rejects Plato and the philosophers and says we have to go to the scriptures. And she goes to Genesis. So she's going to base everything she says from now on Genesis. And she gives an example of two very major passions, which are anger and desire. And makes the point that anger and desire they seem to be at odds with the image of God in us. So they're not the image of God, she's pretty clear about that, but they seem to be vying with the image of God and obedience to God. So now she's introduced an anomaly in experience. She's a very high view of humanity as the image of God, but now she's confronting this experience we have as human beings of being disordered and out of control, apparently. And she's now going to work with this picture, but importantly, the picture will not be framed from Genesis 3, but from Genesis 1. So first of all, she has to make the point that anger and desire, they're not intrinsic qualities of the soul. So it gets a little bit complex here in her argument, but she argues they are not the true image of God in us. They're not the image of God, since we don't apply them to God. So we experience them and they're part of our humanness, but they're not part of our divine image. That's what she's going to say. However, what she is going to say, which is terribly important and I find most helpful, is they are morally neutral. In themselves, they are morally neutral, the passions. So these are not sins. She's not using a synonym for our word sin. Look, desire is a fabulous example. Sexual desire, we know, can be directed to good or to ill. If it's profligate and unconstrained, it's lust and adultery. Within marriage, it's devotion. As a matter of fact, within marriage, if we lose desire for one another, or a husband loses desire for his wife, that's actually not a good thing. So desire as a passion is neither good nor bad. It's like a force within us, and we need it. But the issue is where do we direct it? That's her thinking. And the examples she gives are where these very same desires these passions are in the scripture. In the scripture, they are clearly the source of good. I mean, she gives the example of Daniel's desire to be back in Jerusalem, praiseworthy. One could view the whole angst of the exiles in Babylon desiring to get back to Jerusalem. It was a passion for them. And anger can become righteous anger. She mentions the example of Phineas, but there are plenty of other examples where if I'm angry about something, it actually can be directed towards the good. So depending how we use these energies, they could be orders or passions for orders or disorders. She will say that they are external to the soul. She has this idea, this is what she says: these faculties lie on the boundary of the soul, which, depending on their usage, i.e. how I steer the ship of the passions, could have a good or an evil outcome. And she says that these passions have become attached to the soul, like on the boundaries, from the outside. In other words, they seem to be somewhat of a sharing in perhaps the animal nature that we have, because her view of humanity was a view of humanity that suggests we integrate all forms of life on the planet. She moves to that now in the discussion. She goes back to the very typical classical view of creation. I think it's a beautiful view of creation, that life has levels. So there's a vegetative life which provides an animation, an appetite, and information processing. Plants. And we share that. Our bodies, we share that, because without that, we're not alive. We're dead. Then one level up, there's the sensory life, which would be animals, where we are able now to take inputs through the senses and process them cognitively. And animals do that. But then the third layer up is the intellect, or the mind, or the soul. I think soul is the best word, where we can consciously look at these things and steer them. And that is the image of God. But importantly, she's not saying that this soul in us is like water in a bottle, disconnected from these other inputs, and therefore these other inputs need to be discarded. Not at all. Her view is integrative. And Pico did the same thing in his famous essay in the 15th century that powered the Renaissance on the dignity of humanity. So somehow or other, we're some kind of, you could say, priest, because we We share all aspects of life. We experience all aspects of life, and we are meant to be the arbiters and mediators between all earthly life and the heavens. And it is our mind that is doing that connection. Now, where morality comes in is how we steer the ship of the passions, what we do with them. That's where it comes in. And that is where she says, by the particular use of our free choice, such impulses of the soul become instruments of virtue or wickedness. And she gives the example, another metaphor, just as steel, forged according to the intention of the craftsman, is shaped towards wherever the blacksmith desires. So we're like a blacksmith, we're like a craftsperson, and we have this raw material of the passions, and we've got to forge them into steel, which would be our thought life. And the question is, do we use that steel to build utensils for a kitchen or to build weapons of war? That's what she's saying. The morality comes in how we manage, deploy the passions, not the passions themselves. That's part of our creational mandate and creational providence. She said, if reason, that's her word, I don't think that's a good word to use today, like if the soul gains dominion over these traits, then you could take fear, which is instinctual and sensate. It would produce obedience and caution. Anger, I'm angry, that can produce courage. I'm going to absolutely go for this. Desire, the desiring impulse can go towards, it would mediate us, she says, to divine and immortal pleasures. The ultimate desire would be for God and the good for God. So she then has, I think it's a great example, she goes to Genesis 2 and says this is very much like Adam/humanity ruling over the animals. So the rule over the animals and so on it begins in our souls, where we are ruling over the sensate animalistic in us and directing it, not suppressing it, not getting rid of it, but moving it to honour and the worship of God. That's her picture. And she finishes with the story of the wheat and the tares. And for her, that whole, she uses the field as if it's our soul, and the sowing of the wheat and tares as if it's the passions, which can be good or can be bad. They can be good plants and bad plants. And she develops that metaphorically. She says the enemy sows useless seeds entangled with the roots of their opposites, so that the farmer lets them grow together in order that the nourishing grain might not be pulled up along with the other kind. So in this life, we're sort of, our soul is like a orchard or like a farm, and like it or not, the energy and the growth growing up inside of our souls is passions, and we could move them to good and they become weeds, and move them to evil and they become weeds, move them to good and they become fruit. Because the farmer has let them grow together, because if he prematurely separates them, then there's no fruit. So in God's project of creation, he must let these things play out. That's part of his desire. Not to, you could rid yourself of the problem by just blitzing the whole field and having nothing growing in it at all, and then you've got no problems, but you've got no life either. So by extension, God is letting them grow together, and our job is to mastermind the growth, steer the growth towards the good in all that we do. So she finishes, and by the way, she says the final judgment will be when the field gets cleaned up. So their view of the end of all things, their view of heavenly judgment and heavenly accountability was clearing out the weeds finally. Finishes beautifully with the idea of kingship. In other words, if we can steer the ship of the passions toward the good, we're like a noble king, because we're steering the passions, they're not steering us. If we can't, we're like a slave, because we're just acting on those impulses, and they're starting to govern us and to define us. And she makes the point that they tend to grow, they lead to they lead to miseries and arrogance and which she would, I think, define as misappropriated passions. This is what she says in conclusion. Kingship, therefore, if a person uses these emotions according to the right principles, will be like some king, who by using many hands of his servants for assistance will easily accomplish his virtuous purpose. So we'll be king over the domain of our hearts, and the passions will be our servants toward the good. If, however, as when slaves revolt against their owner, the owner falls into the power of his emotions and passions, uses the word emotion and passions synonymously, and is enslaved by them so that he becomes a puppet of those impulses, he will be drawn inevitably to those actions to which he is forced by the dominations of the passions which control him. A very much more nuanced idea of sin. It's very robust. I find it, it really plays in with a lot of what both David and Ben were saying. I've got to say, in retrospect, I find the traditional view of sin as, some kind of moral lapse and moral code. There's a defined code, and particularly the idea that there's sinful thoughts within me that have some kind of ontology. I find it pretty useless in diagnosing situations. Useless going on, dangerous, because you start to get introspective and overanalyze things. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing a talk one day, because when I consider disordered, difficult situations I've had, say this week, and there's been a couple, and I say, okay, let's try and diagnose those as a Christian with a traditional view of sin. And not only does it not work, it's square pegs in round holes. I mean, what's a sin and what's not, and so on. It just doesn't work. But if you overplay it, it really, like any bad diagnosis, leads to bad reactions. And I think there's way too much of that going on. Whereas Macrina's view, which was very representative of the early church fathers, is actually very wholesome. There's a lot of accountability in it. It relieves you of this sin spotting and over-analysis, but it does give you the task, which he finishes, of mastery. And that in turn implies what David was implying. I therefore need to know what the good is and be continuing to contemplate that, knowing what the light of God is and the fear of the Lord is, so that I don't take my experience of passions I don't misinterpret that as sin. On the contrary, I view them as part of God's ordained situation in humanity, that we would share the life of the earth and the sensate life, but we would bring it into the service and worship of God. So if this does excite you to read more of Macrina, by the way, I've been talking about chapters 2 and 3. The majority of the book is on the resurrection. She's beginning to talk about the soul, but it's readily available. It's a fairly short book, and the other great book of Gregory, or many other great books, but very famous, is On the Making of Man, which our upcoming guest in Gospel Conversation, John Beer, has just published the first translation of On the Making of Man in, I don't know, probably, I gather, 100 years or a long time. We've been suffering under, you know, a pretty old translation, and he calls it on the human image of God. That's what he calls the book. So I hope you find these thoughts as instructive and encouraging and useful as I did. God bless you.